Hey folks, Galen here. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that our 2025 Project Manager Salary Survey is now live. We use this survey to help PMs all over the world get the info they need to get a clear sense of their earning potential. By adding your story to the survey, you're contributing to valuable research that will give you and our entire PM community better pay transparency as you progress through your careers. And once the results are in, we'll send you the full report. To participate, head on over to thedpm.com/salary2025. All right, on with the show. You slammed your laptop shut. For the 17th meeting running, your client contact has gaslit you and your team for a deadline that the client themselves was responsible for. They're escalating to your CEO. You've got 2 days to build your defense. You're fuming, but you start going through old emails and reports. The client is a huge account. When they say jump, your agency asks how high. In your search, you stumble across reports from other projects. You find a complaint that was lodged against the client contact by a previous team. You see hints that past team members may have quit because of this individual. And it would appear that very few projects that this person has been involved in have ever been profitable. You notice that every past project team has suffered what you and your team are suffering now. It's not you. It's them. It's toxic. It's systemic. And it's doing real damage to almost every area of the business. If you've been dealing with challenging and toxic client relationships and are at an impasse about what to do about it, keep listening. We're going to be tackling the question of when and how to fire a client, as well as sharing some tips and techniques for baking support into your client services process. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in. My name is Galen Low with the Digital Project Manager. We're a community of digital professionals on a mission to help each other get skilled, get confident, and get connected so that we can amplify the value of project management in a digital world. If you want to hear more about that, head on over to thedpm.com/membership. Okay, today we are talking about firing a client. Specifically, the process and business considerations around firing a client that maybe is having a toxic impact on the people, the operations, and the finances of an agency. Back in the studio with me today is Melissa Morris, founder of Agency Authority, and herself an agency project management and operations and client services specialist who has lived the agency life for well over a decade. I say well over a decade. In the green room, I was like, I want to describe you as seasoned, but does that make you sound old? Now I was like, oh, gosh, she spent like ages working. She was there when the first agency was created. Yeah, that one backfired on me. Anyways, thank you, Melissa, for being here in the studio with me again today.
Despite the lovely intro, I'm really excited to be here. I've got to be done early, though. You know my bedtime with my seasoned age and all.
We'll give you some time. Yeah, we'll each put our respective dentures into the bubbly water, and yeah. Actually, we did sort of touch on this topic in our last conversation. You've been on the podcast before. We were talking about building rapport with clients and how we can kind of build good, trusting relationships. And we ended with this idea that, actually, some clients are just terrible. And I don't mean intrinsically evil and terrible. I mean, some folks listening are like, are you sure? But sometimes it just isn't a fit. It's not working. And I think that it's something that we don't discuss a lot. Some people are like, oh, I didn't know it was an option to fire a client. They give us money. We need money to operate. I think we need them. But also there's so much damage that can take place. And there's a lot of repercussions that could go along with it that, frankly, just aren't always seen. So I thought maybe let's just get right into it. This idea, right? Firing a client. For some agency project teams, it's a fantasy. But sometimes it is a necessary business decision that agencies don't even keep on the table. So I thought I'd open with just the big question, which is, when is it okay to want to fire a client and when is it not?
So I don't know about you, but every time you say that, I feel I want to go dun dun dun, 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 dun. So to answer that question, though, when is it okay to fire a client and when is it not? And I would say it's always okay to fire a client. You're the agency owner, with the caveat of, are we honoring any legal rights, contractual sort of obligations, right? We would never want to get ourselves in any sort of legal trouble. So make sure you're paying attention there. Now, with that being said, do we want to fire lots of clients? Probably sometimes, right? Depending on the day, the phase of the moon, sometimes we're ready to go on a firing spree. And so I think what we need to talk about here too is maybe not so much when is it okay, but when is it appropriate? Because that is different, right? Like that's a different mindset. So first we need to come to this mindset of it's okay. It's okay to fire a client as long as we're doing it legally and ethically and all of those things. But should we? Do they just kind of drive us bonkers? Or are they actually doing something wrong? And if you listen to the other episode, we talked a lot about how important client relationships are and really nurturing those. So you'll know I am a big, big fan of keeping the clients you have and maintaining relationships. But we also know sometimes there are just bad clients. And there comes a point where it doesn't matter how much they're paying you. It's just not working. They're never going to be happy with the product you deliver. They're always going to miss their deadlines. They're going to reschedule meetings. They're going to email you at all hours of the night. And despite your best efforts, they're just not coming on board.
Mm-hmm. I like the spiciness of that. Doesn't matter how much money they're paying you because, I've worked in agencies where it's basically like, do whatever. They make up 70% of our revenue or whatever, right? Maybe hopefully not that much of a balance, but their role in our ability to operate is significant enough that anything they ask for is okay. But that also can be bad. And then I've heard stories too where similarly, they're like, oh, we need this client. Like we must do everything. And actually they lifted the hood. They realized actually the client was bad for business, period. Not bad for like culture and like everyone's mental well-being and health and all that stuff. But actually they weren't making money off that client, even though the numbers were big.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And we are so good at coming up with topics. So we'll table this. But I see that all the time where an agency said, that's our biggest client. Whatever they want, they get, we do. They're keeping the lights on around here. They make up so much revenue. And we start time tracking and digging into those reports. I'm like, did you know you're working for $22 an hour?
Right. Yes.
Did you know that? And they're, oh my gosh, what? So absolutely right there. Sometimes top line doesn't match up with bottom line.
The other thing that I'm reading in there and hearing from you is that some of these decisions, like it's a team sport in a way, right? And even just to put a project management lens on it, a lot of project managers working in an agency, where that is the directive, right? It's like, do whatever. This client gives us lots of money and you kind of feel helpless and you're like, I don't have the authority to fire a client. But guess what? The agency owner can't really do it on their own either, right? We have to involve legal. We have to talk to the teams. And it actually is this thing that doesn't get unilaterally decided. I mean, sometimes I'm sure it does, but most of the time in my experience, it's not something that gets unilaterally decided by one person. You don't come to work one day and be like, oh, remember that client? Yeah, they're gone. It's something that is considered. It's a conversation and there's multiple perspectives that need to go into it. I wanted to maybe zoom out a bit because you have deep firsthand experience managing clients in the agency world. And maybe without naming names, like what's the worst client experience you've ever had? And how did you turn that toxic experience into a learning experience?
So I want to share an example. And I think this is a really good one to talk about because we can have bad clients that can be saved and turned into good clients. Sometimes there are bad ones that we need to fire, but I want to share a story about a terrible client. So years ago when I worked in the agency world as, account manager, I was definitely more junior. I was in a junior role, but I was working on our agencies, one of our biggest accounts. We were doing the regional advertising for the local cable company. And I was a little more junior, but getting more responsibility. And the cable company had brought on a new marketing coordinator as well. So we were tasked with getting an ad done, a very simple ad. I mean, this thing should have taken no more than like an hour or two tops. We spent probably 2 weeks going back and forth and racked up, I think, almost 15 hours, almost 15 hours. She would send me an email, hey, change the picture to this. And then, hey, change this copy edit to that. Hey, I just noticed the copyright date is wrong. Can you go ahead and just piecemealing all these little, then she changed the photo back somewhere around revision number 7, driving me crazy. And then finally we get this ad done. Then the bill goes out. Her boss calls my boss. She's in trouble. And so am I. Right. I'm in a lot of trouble. The VP of the agency is looking at me and they're going, what did you do? I'm like, she had all these revisions. She was piecemealing them to me. Like, I don't understand. Like, And she goes, "You're in charge. You should have led this. Did you tell her how this was going to impact the budget of this ad?" "Oh, no, I didn't." "Okay, did you tell her she needed to collect all of her revisions at one time and send them to you at one time?" "I think I forgot to mention that also." "Oh, okay. So this is on you as well." And so this is where we talk about there's always careful consideration. Not that I had the authority, but in that moment, would I have been like, "You're fired," would have felt that way, right? But this comes back to your processes, having conversations, having a plan in place. So now with that being said, if that conversation had looked like, did you continue to tell them how this was going to impact the timeline? Yes. Did you tell them that excessive revisions were going to incur a lot of additional charges? Yes, I told them that. Did you tell them that? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, then I did my part. That wasn't on me, then that was on the client. And so this is where we can see if we're doing a good job managing, if we're being really clear about what's needed, we're working through the process, then that will tell us, is it a bad client or are we just not managing things very well? And then at that point, it's decision time. Do we fire or do we keep?
It's funny because in our last episode, we were talking about account manager skills that project managers are never taught. And then the reverse is like the project management skills that account managers are never taught.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like it's going to impact the budget. You got to tell them that. You're like, "Oh, yeah. Okay. But I was, an account manager. I wasn't trained that way." That's really interesting. So that one turned around or ended up being still one of those clients?
Well, I will say eventually that working relationship did end. We'll just put it at that.
Fair enough. And I think that's the thing. There's work to be done to maybe not always salvage, I guess, but I think just to at least try, make the attempt to salvage, I guess, because we've been talking about throughout this episode and last is that like establishing and growing these relationships, like time and energy and money has been invested into this. And it's expensive in more ways than just money to just discard them. So I think that's a really sort of interesting thought that I don't think always crosses people's mind when they're thinking, "Gosh, we've got to fire this client." It's not like, am I doing everything I can to make sure things are clear? And, could the ship be righted? And is it worth it? I thought I'd maybe ask kind of around the sort of toxic client side of things, because sometimes maybe it's not that toxic, right? And it's addressable. But what are some telltale signs that a relationship actually is toxic, that they are a toxic client having a toxic impact on your team, yourself, your business?
Yeah. And it's funny because the clients that always push back on timeline or always late to meetings, never get us what we need, blowing up our email. And so those bad clients can be very easy to spot. But there are bad clients that are much harder to spot because they're a little bit more manipulative. They're pushy in like their own little way. And I had one of these, unfortunately, probably 2 years ago at this point. This woman was never rude to me. She was not emailing me after hours. She met her deadlines, but she was routinely trying to push the scope of work over and over. So I would get on a call with her and we'd be talking, "You do X, Y, and Z, right? No, that's not included in the scope. That's not what we offer," right? So I'm operating integrity. I had a clear scope of work. I am confirming like this is not what's included. Okay. A week later, we get on the call. "So you guys will do X, Y, and Z for me, right?" No, that's not what we're going to do. Week after week, this type of behavior is continuing where it's always, "You'll do that, right?" Or, "I'm going to send you over the things. I can get those to you today. So you could get this together by like Thursday, right?" No. And it got to the point where I just knew every time I got on that call, I would have a pit in my stomach. And I knew she's going to push the scope here, like every time. And sure enough, every time she did. And so it did get to a point where I'm looking back at my scope of work. I'm looking back at my contract and I'm like, we're all done here. And I had to send that email, like, here's what I have as our scope. Here is what we have accomplished. Here's what we're going to wrap up. And this is our end date. And I, was in my contract. I still wanted to deliver on my promises to her, make sure I was honoring what I said I would. But I was also like, we're all done. So I think it's easy to spot the people who are egregious
Right. Yes.
And it can be harder to find the people who are just being sneaky about it. So I wanted to point that out.
That's really interesting because, yeah, like in my past, the like most notable client that we ever fired at the agencies I was at was the client that was egregious. Like the team came back crying every time. There's folks who maybe talking to a professional about their experiences there. And those are kind of like, they're like, oh, yeah, we got to do something about this. But the like more insidious, and I was going to say manipulative, but I think the thing about that story of yours is that it's this sort of like constant imbalance, that it's never like a level footing. It's never going to become a partnership. It's abusive in the sense that every time I'm going to be like, hey, give me your lunch money. And even if you say no, I'm still going to ask you next time. And even if it's not, if they're not getting your lunch money, it's still sort of bullying behavior. Yeah. And it's not a level and even relationship.
That's exactly right.
I'm curious, kind of like from that perspective, I get the whole wrapping the scope and being like, yeah, we're done here. In the event that it's something that needs to be escalated to, should we fire this client decision? Like, what can someone on the front line, an account manager or a project manager, someone on the project team, what can they do to kind of voice these concerns so that it does get looked at and addressed?
Yeah, I think the thing is to focus on the facts, because it can be easy to when, oh, well, they're just rude. Well, what does rude look like? Well, their emails are really short. Well, maybe they don't like to type emails, right? Like I can't fire a client because they send, I think we talked about this too. You've gotten clients who would respond with like, fine, period. We can't fire somebody because they don't like to type. Do you know? I think especially, even if you're the person who would be making the decision, but especially if you are bringing this to other people, maybe with the recommendation that I don't think this is a good relationship, I think it's important to focus on facts. We had to rearrange a deadline because they kept neglecting to get us what we want. And this is how it impacted the team. And I had to work late. They said that they were going to pay an additional fee, but when they got the invoice, they called and complained, and we ended up cutting that, and we didn't pay it after all because they said they didn't understand that there was a fee. These are the emails where I followed up and said that their deadline was Tuesday, and they still, on Thursday said, oh, I didn't know you needed it. So just having some really clear data points and focusing on the facts is going to be really important to make sure that you are making the right decision and not doing from a charged place or an emotional place.
That's a really good point. And, I think my knee-jerk reaction was, it's too bad that our, like, whatever impact to mental health and, and some of the less tangible sort of impacts isn't something that an agency would take seriously. But actually, I'm like, well, hold on. I had to pause myself. I'm like, you still have to kind of make this rational case because it can still encompass that, right? And like you said, right, it's like, because of this, the team and I had to work late. And this is the impact, and it's factual. And not to say that you have to pull the emotion out of it, but to say that this is a decision that requires facts to make sure that, because it impacts not just you, it impacts people working on this project. You're going to fire this client mid-project. Guess what's going to happen? Those folks all go on bench. It's something that needs to be considered. And I do like that approach of kind of saying like, listen, just like make sure we gather the facts, because someone on the outside, it's hard for them to evaluate and say, yeah, okay, we'll just fire that client tomorrow. Like, I trust you. It's a bit more considered than that, even if they do trust you. So I do like that sort of gathering of facts.
Absolutely. And I think we're both in agreement too. Your mental health and well-being is an important piece of this puzzle. But I can tell you, it is going to be a very, very, very rare instance where the only way they are showing up in a toxic way is with your mental health and well-being, right? Mm-hmm. Someone who is showing up in that way is almost always showing up in factual ways as a bad client. It's going to be rare where they're just like emotionally showing up as a bad client. That just seems to be the way that works. Maybe it never happens, but I'm sure sometimes it happens. But to speak to that, if you're feeling like with me, I'm like, oh, I've got this pit in my stomach. Mm-hmm. Why do I feel like I'm always like in this weird defensive mode? Those were very uncomfortable. And I love my clients. Big fan of client relationships. That's not like me to feel like, oh, I do not want to. And then when I looked under the hood and said, what is making me uncomfortable about this? Oh, here are the data-driven facts that are coming up. She's pushing scope. She's pushing timelines, right? Okay, I see now. And so then I could say, you want but I don't offer. So it makes sense for this relationship to end.
I like that it's sort of tying it back to that story where it was kind of insidious and almost hard to put a finger on, but it's there. And actually, this sort of, my story where it's like the team came back from every meeting crying multiple times. I'm like, oh, yeah, actually, that's the like big culmination of stuff we probably should have identified way earlier and started gathering facts about way earlier. And some of it, I know you're huge on process. And frankly, like, we didn't have a process for this. And actually, a lot of the agencies that I have worked with do not have a formal client offboarding process, even from identifying problem areas all the way through to like, talking to the legal team and figuring out, are we contractually okay to take this action? And then also even that process of like, how do we support the team with the fallout? Yes, emotionally, but also like financially, right? As like, do they still have job security after this client went away? And how can we talk about it? But, how do you advise your agency clients and agency teams to just be like better set up with some formal process and policy around ending client relationships and supporting the team that, sort of ends up on bench or having a sort of unfinished project as a result?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. One is I'm a huge fan of a client communication SOP for all agencies. And this is something I recommend all agency owners have. And it addresses things like what to do when your client has excessive revisions, when or when not to introduce a rush fee, when do I need to escalate a project or a concern up the ladder and get it to senior management. So sometimes that looks like anytime a client misses a meeting, you need to let somebody know. If you send 2 emails and you don't hear back from them, you need to let us know. So sometimes even just trying to find those things early on can either help us course correct if there's just been, in my earlier ad fiasco, right? Sometimes like just some training gets us back on track, or sometimes we're going to go the direction like the client that I ultimately had to part ways with. But let's start figuring that out early on. I think also too that SOP should have templates that your account managers and project managers can use so that if you do have a client who's feeling a little pushy and they send that kind of bully email, let's just give them a template that makes it easy for them to be firm about what is not going to happen or what is going to happen. And they can lean on that so then they don't have to feel the weight of that. And then as the agency or business owner, you know that this is getting handled in the way you want it to. So I think really empowering them with some very clear, like we've talked about, processes, policies, what does this look like at the agency is a really great start to help someone navigating and dealing with that. And then when it comes to that actual offboarding moment where it's like, this is not working and we are parting ways with these people, having a very, very clear action plan of what that looks like. These are the tasks we have agreed to finish. This is what we know is not going to get finished. This is what we're going to hand off. And then this is the date that we are passing the baton, and be very clear in that email that says, this concludes our working relationship. That email has those words. It doesn't say, here are your final files. Let us know if you need anything. Or here's that thing we talked about. Thanks. No, this concludes our working relationship. Be very, very clear about that. Don't leave that door open for something else to sneak in.
The 2 things I love most about that are, one, the SOP actually is built in a way that surfaces information early rather than after, like when it's happening in case of fire break glass. Like it's like there's a check and balance there for communication, but also that wording of like, this concludes our working relationship. I've definitely been on a number of projects where I find out 6 months down the road that the support team is still getting requests and they're still processing them and they're like still working on documentation together that should have been handed off. And yeah, in fairness, I was like, sometimes the communication wasn't there. The clarity wasn't there. That like, this is the end date wasn't spoken. And there's so many things that sometimes we feel uncomfortable speaking out loud or having a conversation about. I guess the other thing I love is that notion that, yes, and there's a template to help you have firm language. You don't have to come up with it on your own. And we'll stand behind it because it's something that we created as an organization to address this. And it takes a lot of that edge off, that pressure of being like, I have to like say it's over. Like I'm breaking up with my client and like I'm spending hours agonizing over how to do it. But like to kind of have it as, okay, this is our process. I might tailor this template a bit, but it's the firm language we use because it creates clarity and draws a line in the sand of like, what we're doing and what we're not doing to sort of conclude this relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And even one of those templates could even look like a pass the buck one. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but if you know that something really will need to go to leadership or conversations about firing or on deck here, they could even have a canned email so they can feel empowered to say, like, I want to let you know I've received this, but I do need to discuss this internally. We're going to get back to you by X date. And then you can send that. So that also gives you a little breathing room to reflect on what's going on here. Is this bullying? Are they just pushing scope? What's happening? I need to take this internally. So you can respond to them in a very timely fashion, but also let them know whether they, no answer is still an answer, right? Or no update is still an update is what, like that project management term, right?
Yeah.
Like, I just want to let you know I'm tracking this, but that's all I'm doing at this point is tracking this.
And I think it's such an important thing for folks to hear where, especially in the agency world and client services in general, you kind of feel pressured. No matter what role you play on the team, you feel pressured to give a response right away. You should know, shouldn't you? They've hired you as experts. You should have the answer right now. And the reality is you don't have to, but you can acknowledge gotcha, right? Message received. We're going to take some time with this. And that goes for things that are positive and it goes for things that are negative and, escalatory and inflammatory and all those other
all
good
the
words. Yeah, all the Atories. Yeah. A lot of folks listening will be like, yeah, either we're already good at doing that where I work, or man, doesn't that sound amazing? We're going to start working on this right away. Honestly, for any team, not just agency teams, but any team working in sort of a client services context, sometimes they feel stuck in a toxic relationship and their organization isn't willing to do anything about it. What can an individual do to look out for themselves in that situation?
It's similar to the response I said before, focus on facts and really pull up that scope of work. Do really adhere to processes to a T. Don't skip a follow-up. Don't fudge a meeting or here or there. Really lean into the templates and the processes that the agency has provided you. And if that is a gap, then request that. If they're not going to fire the client, then maybe we can request that they equip us with the tools to better manage or wrangle the client. So I think that's absolutely a fair request. And I can tell you, I would think most business owners would be in support of honoring that request, right? Because if the idea here is no, the client gets what they want, the client needs to be happy, it will help me make our client happy if you give me some templated emails that speak to rounds of revisions so that I can make sure I'm being really, really clear about what we need to get from them to finish our work. So then really you're coming to them asking for some resources to make the client happy, which is ultimately what they want.
I mean, I like that sort of, yeah, or requests to sort of say, hey, listen, this is going to improve things for the business. And actually coming at it from both sides, having sort of been part of an agency leadership team, I know this is kind of to manage expectations for folks. I know that it doesn't always get received well by a leadership team, sometimes behind the scenes. They're like, oh my gosh, this creates work. Now we have to go and write these templates. And I wish, we just had people who could figure it out. And I think that's kind of it's probably not everyone's reaction, but I've seen that reaction at a leadership level. But I've also seen it then net out later to be like, sure, glad we did that. Really happy that person raised that. It did create work. Don't get me wrong. Everything is disruption is hard for us to deal with as humans, sort of operating a business as well. The net benefit is there. And I think that's the important bit, is that it might kind of seem like you've created work for somebody by requesting this, but in the end, it does sort of net out as a benefit for people, for the business, just for clarity in the relationships. It's a forcing function for maturing a business, for lack of a better word. Not to say that the thing that pushes a business forward is to have toxic clients, but but certainly considering some of these SOPs, whether they've happened in the past a lot or not, just having a way to deal with these things that do happen in business.
Absolutely. And that might even just look like, here are the emails I send when I'm following up and checking in, and they miss the deadline every time. And designers mad at me and the copywriter's mad at me and things are happening last minute. What should I change in these emails to be more clear? Maybe I'm just not seeing it. Maybe I think I'm being really clear. Let me know. This is the process I've been following. I send this email. I wait 2 days. I send this email. I send these reminders. Where am I missing the mark here? And then that's a good opportunity for them to look and, oh, you've even given us the process. Oh, here's where actually you're not really clear. I'm reading this a completely different way. Or it really might start to shine a light and say, oh, they're not just kind of being a squeaky wheel. Like, this client sucks. Like, what are we going to do about it?
It is the escalation, but it's also kind of like asking for feedback and that due diligence that we talked about, where it's like, are we doing everything we can to make this a good relationship? And if it's still not worth it, when the data shows that it's not worth it, like, let's have a pathway to do something about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it all comes back to processes, right? I think clarity and a process for handling it, I think, is the biggest takeaway here, because it's not an easy decision. We spent a whole episode talking about how important your clients are, nurturing those relationships. And so it's not something we want to do willy-nilly, but it is important to recognize that sometimes it's just a bad client. It's not me, it's you. And you gotta go. It's you. Yes. But we want to be careful because it does impact revenue. It does impact our team. It could have a lot of ripple effects. So we never want to take that decision lightly. And I just think the more processes we have in place, the more we're focusing on the facts and the more we're addressing things sooner rather than later, the better off that we're going to be.
I love that. And for anyone who realizes that they need to do that in their business, I think you've just given them a pretty good head start. Awesome. Melissa, thank you so much for joining me again today. I loved our discussion. You were right. We can always come up with topics. Would love to have you back on the show.
Anytime. We could talk all day, I'm pretty sure. We're both talkers.
We're going to stop recording and then probably keep talking for 3.5 hours.
It's possible. It's possible.
All right, folks, there you have it. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation with over 1,000 like-minded project management champions, come join our collective. Head on over to thedpm.com/membership to learn more. And if you like what you heard today, please subscribe and stay in touch on thedigitalprojectmanager.com. Until next time, thanks for listening.